Welcome to the first official episode of Tuesday Talk, the podcast. You can probably hear the smile on my face right now. I am so excited. It is so surreal that I'm even saying this right now because, wow. I am certified life and mindset coach Kayla Jones, and on this podcast, we discuss the lessons I've learned and perspectives I've shifted throughout my life and ongoing into real time. As you get to know me, you'll learn that when it comes to certain topics, I'm one who just likes to rip the band-aid off and get straight to it. With that being said, that's as much as an introduction as I can give that doesn't become repetitive to the overall trailer of this podcast. Okay, y'all. So, as I sit here and reflect on my spiritual journey, like the ups, the downs, and how I got to where I am now, I had a revelation that was very much a personal breakthrough. I got to a point in this journey where I got really offended when someone called me a Christian. Like, the second I heard that word, I was immediately triggered and was ready to go to war to defend myself. Now, it's Tuesday and we're going to talk about it, but first, let me rewind a little bit. So, since I was a little girl, I've always had some type of spiritual basis. I grew up knowing that there is a God and that God is real. I grew up knowing that God is love and that He is the creator of all. It was all very simple. And when I got to grade school, I attended Catholic school from second grade all the way through to eighth grade. It was then that I learned more in depth about God's love for us to the extent of Jesus, who was sent purely out of love for us to teach us how to live, to teach us how to love, and how to honor God with our lives and everything we do while actively walking in obedience to the call God has on our life. Even still, the message was clear across the board that God is love. And truthfully, that was about as much as I could digest back then anyway. Now, friend, bear with me because maybe you grew up in the church and you know all about it. Maybe you're familiar with God but still figuring the whole thing out. Maybe you just don't understand any of it and have deemed it isn't for you and decided you'll just stick with knowing you believe in something greater than ourselves and just call it universe or higher power. Whatever the background is, I can pinpoint every era in my spiritual walk that relates directly to each of those experiences. Trust me. So, as I've mentioned, throughout this podcast, we discuss lessons I've learned and perspectives I've shifted in life. And that includes, but is not limited to, how I've had to relearn and redefine my relationship with God. And the one thing I've learned is this. I talked to several people, whether it was like my clients, friends, family, or even like that random stranger in aisle 7 at the grocery store who just decided it was the perfect time to dump their life story on you. And one thing like majority of us seem to have in common when it comes to this spiritual walk is that we can all remember a point in our journey where we decided to drop everything and disconnect from being so close to God because of a certain hurt we experienced, right? We experienced something that so boldly disrupted everything we thought we knew, that stripped us down to our core and really forced us to believe another narrative about who God is. Now, in my personal experience, the same view I grew up with and carried with me for years of who I knew God to be was flipped completely upside down when I was force-fed teachings that depicted God to be this vengeful dictator who was ready to burn you up and cast you to hell if you even breathed the wrong way, right? And the amount of rules alone left minimal room for movement, and it made it seem like this God was just absolutely impossible to please no matter what you did because he wanted perfection out of us. And we all know by now that perfection doesn't exist. And this narrative was just so suffocating and took the life and light out of the God I thought I knew. My original narrative was in pieces, y'all. It was in shambles. But wait, because isn't this the same thing that happened to Eve in the garden? When the serpent planted that one seed of doubt about God and it went against everything Eve knew about God. And so in turn, she decided to make a decision that separated her from God because everything she thought she knew was already in question. Side note, If you haven't read the book Woman Evolve by Pastor Sarah Jakes Roberts, y'all, I love her. Love that book. I highly recommend that you do so because she breaks down this whole Eve narrative topic. About being relatable to Eve. She breaks it down far more eloquently than I can. Okay. So just put that in your sticky notes somewhere. But anyway, all of this to say, in this respect, not much has changed since the garden. You know, much like Eve, I experienced the spiritual doubt so deeply that I said, you know what? I'm just going to keep it simple. I believe in a higher power, and I believe that the law of attraction is the simplified answer for manifestation. And ultimately, as long as I'm a good person, then everything should be all good. And as long as I pray and stay connected to this higher power source, then I don't need a setting like church and all the extra stuff just to prove I have a connection to a higher power. Oh boy, was I wrong. Okay. I was so freaking wrong. And that was the longest lesson I've ever learned in life. I fell into a place where things in my life actually got worse because ultimately I tried to do life completely on my own with no true power source of hope or faith for the things I could not see. I believe that what I could see and what was happening to me in every moment was pretty much it. And that was a very depressing way to live, actually. But little did I know, the same way it took a radical experience for me to question everything I thought I knew is the same way it took a radical experience for me to proclaim the love, goodness, and omnipotence of God again. Truthfully, it wasn't until last year, October 2022, I'll never forget, that was the month I surrendered my own will to God's will. I gave him my yes, and I have not looked back since. And now, because I only consider me having been on this journey solidly for a year now, there are still new depths that I'm learning and even things that I'm still unlearning. But the perspective I had to shift, and quite recently, might I add, was this. So when I intentionally, chose to dive deeply into growing in intimacy with God again, and honestly more maturely this time, my walk through life began to change. The way I thought began to change. The way I spoke began to change. The things I did began to change. But it was the most natural, subtle shift ever. Like, the only thing that even brought most of these changes to my attention is when people began to label me, saying, Kayla is a Christian. Yeah, she's religious. Like, what? And hearing this, I started to defend myself like, I am not religious. I am not a freaking Christian. Don't ever put me in a box with religion. Like, I'm not a Christian. I was so irrationally fired up that as a mindset coach, I had to step back, sit myself down and ask myself like, no, let's pick this apart, sis, because why are you so offended? What is it about this Christian religious statement that just sends you off the edge? So I sat with that question for a while. I sat with it for quite a few days, actually, until one day, I'm doing my due diligence, scrolling on social media, and I came across an ad for becoming a certified Christian life coach. And yep, my blood started heating up. Like, are you kidding me? What does this even mean? Like, I'm just irrational about it at this point. Like, come on now, Kayla, the same way you have Christian therapists and other things, this is no different. Anyway, of course I clicked the ad because I'm curious. And as I'm reading the description, I became extremely humbled because a lot of what is said is very much exactly like what I already do with my clients. So then my thought process goes, wait, by this description, does that technically mean I'm a Christian life coach? I don't want that title because it may make people shy away from my coaching. If I took on that extra title, what would people think? Boom, stick a pin in that. What would people think? It was that very question I asked when the revelation was dropped in my spirit about my trigger with the word Christian. Though this was something I knew, it wasn't until this moment where it really sank in that most people have a pretty bad taste in their mouths about Christians, and I myself was one of them. Like, that word was such a huge part of my spiritual hurt and my spiritual doubt, and it didn't show up that I was still wounded by it until this moment. And if you're like me, The word Christian was often associated with words like judgmental and hypocrites, people who hide behind God and his word, but never practice what they preach and bear rotten fruits of a tainted heart like dishonesty, jealousy, hatred, unforgiveness, judging and looking down on others, and so on. It was then that I realized my offense not only came from the hurt I experienced, but it also came from just the mere thought of being placed in a category with people of those characteristics. It took a lot of maturing and even healing to realize that not all people who proclaim themselves as Christian are as evil as I once experienced them to be. And while I despise being put in a box, that is very much the exact same thing that I did when I chose to villainize all Christians. Oh, but wait, that wasn't even the hardest pill to swallow, right? The hardest pill I had to swallow throughout this shift in perspective is that, by literal definition, being a Christian means to believe in Jesus Christ and follow his teachings. Someone who takes the lessons that Jesus taught and strives to apply them in their daily lives, to love as Jesus did, to treat others as Jesus did, to serve as Jesus did, and walk in obedience to the call of God the same way Jesus did. So I had to get real with myself. I had to tell myself, like, I fought so hard not to be called a Christian without even realizing by true literal definition, Kayla, you are in fact in alignment with a Christian. And to actively strive to walk in this definition is a beautiful thing. To live a just life, to love and do well by others, and to honor God. I remember there was another time I was, doing my due diligence, scrolling on social media again, and I came across a post that said, "Oh, she doesn't act like a Christian." And God replied, "I don't need actors." And that really brought my revelation full circle, because there are people who do in fact act like Christians when the spotlight is perfectly centered. But when the director yells cut, the teachings of Jesus gets left on the stage, and 9 times out of 10, these are the people we've encountered who have obliterated what we thought we knew. And now, let's be clear, because this isn't to say that people are perfect at every corner or that the journey is a perfect cakewalk. But I am saying there is a difference between honoring God and respecting the Holy Spirit that lives within you by the things you do and the way you operate, at least majority of the time, versus taking God's script and being an actor or abiding by religious dogma and judging those who don't. At the end of the day, I believe in Jesus and the example he set on how to live and love. And I am proud to be able to take these defining moments in my spiritual walk to bring me in deeper relationship with God, because this journey has been life-changing, to say the least. And so, friend, I just want to encourage you. If you're someone who has experienced a spiritual hurt or doubt, I encourage you to dig up those roots and make room for God to plant new seeds in your heart. Start over, get to know him exactly for who he is and how he feels about you, and grow a relationship with him, because ultimately that is what it's all about.